Hi everyone, and welcome to our second roundtable of this year in this series focused on inclusivity in academia. If you haven't watched our previous roundtable on the role that ethnicity plays in academia, I would encourage you to go check it out on our YouTube channel. Today's roundtable will focus on gender bias in academia, which I hope will be of interest to the animal behavior life community, as our community seems to be composed of 60 to 70% of women. And at our last conference, 29% of you stated that you strongly consider your gender as a barrier to success in the scientific community, which was actually the second highest barrier that you reported after your country's socioeconomic status. I'm therefore delighted to welcome Dr. Kathleen Grogan, Assistant Professor at the University of Cincinnati, if I'm pronouncing it correctly, I'm sorry about that, who wrote the article entitled How the Scientific Community Can Confront Gender Bias in the Workplace. Let me share my screen so you can see how it looks like, which was published in Nature, Ecology and Evolution in 2019. Our second panelist is Dr. Britta Glennon, Assistant Professor at the University of Pennsylvania, if I have this right, who co-wrote Women Are Credited Less in Science Than Men. I should maybe put it in the full screen. No, sorry about that. Women Are Credited Less in Science Than Men, published in Nature in 2022. Our third panelist is Dr. Deyatima Ghosh, visiting fellow at the University of Lincoln and postdoctoral fellow at the Ashoka Trust for Research in Ecology and the Environment, who will be sharing her experience of the barriers she has faced in her career as a woman in academia. And finally, Tamzin Barber, Director and Vice President of Dolphin Research Australia, as well as an illustration freelancer and researcher. Could not make it today because of the time difference with Australia, but she sent us an audio recording where she also talks about the challenges she has met as a woman in academia. So we will be able to play this recording and react to it during this roundtable. My name is Natasha Rossi. I am part of the Animal Behavior Life Organizing Committee, and together with Alexis Buatois, who also is a member of the Organizing Committee of Animal Behavior Life, we will co-chair this roundtable together. So there are two overarching questions that we would like to address today. The first one is, how does gender impact prospects of an academic career? And the second one is, what can be done to make academia more inclusive? So to tackle the first questions, there are two related dimensions of gender and the academic profession that we shall consider at the outset: the question of the entry into the profession and the question of experience within it. So I guess this figure from your article, Kathleen, is a nice illustration of this. You called this figure the leaky pipeline of women in STEM. So could you tell us a little bit more about this?
Sure. So this figure documents some of the most egregious examples of the barriers that women face either getting into STEM or succeeding once they're within STEM. So as it sort of documents, we tried to start on this figure from the entry level. So, and things that affect your entrance into science are things like getting recommendation letters. Women are 10 to 20% less likely to become independent PIs, despite the fact that women represent something like, I think it's 60% of PhD recipients in fields like animal behavior or anthropology. It goes down from in some of the, as we get to the harder, I hate that word, but as you get into things like engineering, the number of women that receive doctorates is lower. But this status or this statistic is equivalent across the disciplines. Women are less likely to be employed as graduate students in a male PI's lab, and this is exacerbated in the labs of successful male PIs. So those male PIs that receive HHMI funding or are considered to be rock stars in their field. Basically, this was a PNAS paper. that basically showed that rock star men are much, much less likely to employ women as postdocs, graduate students, and technicians. And we all know that pedigree matters. Where you did your bachelor's, if you did a lab technician position, where you did your graduate degree matters. And if you are less likely to get into a lab that is well-funded, has a lot of name recognition, et cetera, that represents a barrier. However, clearly women are still succeeding in getting doctorate degrees. This is the biggest leak in the pipeline, though, is that transition from doctorate to an independent PI position. And it has lots of different sort of leaks out of the pipeline. One is that women are much more likely to end up in teaching roles at smaller liberal arts colleges, primary undergrad institutions, et cetera. They're less likely to end up in tenure track positions at R1 institutions. If they do end up in a tenure track position in an R1 institution, they are often offered less startup money than men are. Some of that has to do with field, et cetera, but this particular statistic comes from a single school looking at, it was a medical school looking at the startup packages offered. And so in theory, field really shouldn't matter all that much there. And yet the average startup for the women at that institution was almost $500,000 less. Less money equals less time, less opportunity to collect data, a smaller lab. This is another statistic that's not included in here, but women often have a smaller lab footprint than men do. If you've ever seen the movie or the show Picture a Scientist, that's one of the founding tenets of one of the woman's experience at, I want to say it was MIT. It was either MIT or Cold Spring Harbor, where she went and actually measured the lab space available to women versus the lab space available to men. And women had about half the lab space available to men. Once $500,000 less translates to less preliminary data, which then translates to women submitting fewer grants, even though we're just as likely to get funded if we do submit those grants. And then you get into the women being less likely to have their manuscripts accepted if they're last authors, meaning senior PIs, versus, although that doesn't hold true for women as first authors. And yeah, I mean, I could go on there, and there's updated statistics on all of this since I wrote this article in 2018.
Oops, sorry, I didn't find my mic. Yes, thank you for this overview. So basically, this pipeline represents all the barriers that a woman will face, is likely to face along her career. And
it highlights the particularly scary ones. This is absolutely not all of them. There are many additional barriers. Motherhood represents one, in terms of time lost, et cetera. Moving, right? You have to switch locations between positions. It's often, this isn't captured in this graph, but even if you're a single woman without children, statistically, women are less likely to get hired just because of the whole motherhood question. So these are the most egregious examples, but there are lots of other leaks along this pipeline that are not shown here.
All right. So I guess the first two leaks in the pipeline here correspond to barriers that we would face at the entry into the profession, whereas the rest is related to the experience within. Could you just expand a little bit more about the entry into the profession? Because not everything is represented on this pipeline. I know absolutely. You have more examples.
Yeah, so even though women are just as likely to get bachelor's degrees in STEM, in fact, I think the latest data for the US at least, is that STEM bachelor degrees are representative of the US population. So the same number of women that are in the US population get STEM bachelor degrees, but they are less likely to even enter graduate school. And part of that is that, I mean, again, if you're looking at this, to get into graduate school, you need to do research in a lab. which you're less likely to do as a female undergraduate, et cetera, right? You also face the issue of, what's it called? Stereotype threat, right? Where particularly in math heavy fields, et cetera, women often face comments about how women are bad at math, et cetera. And that results in a feedback loop where then women don't enter graduate school at the same level that men do in those fields. And when it comes to being a graduate, right? So it sort of depends on what you're talking about in terms of entry to the field. As it turns out, women in some of the non-engineering fields, so things like biological sciences, animal behavior, et cetera, women are overrepresented in graduate degrees and masters and PhDs. And that's the first step to entry, right? But the real step to entry to academia is getting a postdoc or a faculty position. And as graduate students, women I think the funding rates are about equivalent. I'm trying to remember what exactly the most recent data are. I mean, as you know, but all of these things, right? If you're less likely to submit grants, women often end up in TA positions instead of RA positions. As a TA, you have less time to do your research. Those positions are less prestigious, et cetera. Again, you're less likely to end up in these rock star labs, less likely to get good recommendation letters, and all of that. Women are just as equally likely to transition to a postdoc position, but something like, I want to say it's like 30 or 40% less likely to transition to an independent PI position, that's where I consider the barrier to entry to academia to be, because we've clearly shown that the problem is not getting water into the pipeline when it comes to graduate school, right? We have representative numbers of men and women in graduate school in fields like animal behavior. The biggest leak occurs at the transition to an independent PI, and that's the entry-level barrier.
Yeah, I would argue that even at the postdoc level, because I'm a postdoc, and in my previous lab when I arrived, the PhD students were, oh, wow, it's the first female postdoc that we are welcoming in the lab. So, yeah. And
that first female badge is great, isn't it? That first female badge is everyone's favorite badge.
Yeah, I was actually taken back because I was not expecting this. I was not expecting this label to be put on me. So, but I accept this. But yeah, I was surprised. And am I wrong in assuming that all these stats that you have presented, Katie, are focused on cis women?
Yeah.
Does it include trans women at all?
No, this paper is out of date already. It's from 2018. It includes, and I've actually thought about writing an update to it, because most of these data come from white cis women. So only in the last few years have people been better about including ethnicity in a lot of their analyses when they start to ask these kinds of questions. And let's be honest, often the sample sizes for non-white people are so small that you can't even include them in the statistical analysis. And so almost all of these data are for cis women who are white, mostly in the United States. That's where most of these data come from. And so these data are honestly a little bit out of date. They don't include non-binary people. They don't include people of color in general. I mean, in the sense that they do include people of color, but they did not none of these papers looked at intersectional identity.
Yeah, so I just would like to maybe say a few words about trans women in particular, because I've read this paper that highlighted how much of trans women actually quit the academic system way before graduation level and so on. So there is this study, the US National Survey, that was published in 2015 with more than 20,000 trans respondents, which showed that 3 out of 4 trans students in elementary and secondary schools reported being assaulted, disciplined for defending themselves, or required to dress according to their sex assigned at birth. 2 out of 5 trans girls had to leave school early or were expelled because of gender-based mistreatment. Among trans women who made it to higher education institutions, 1 in 4 trans women in college experienced assault, and 2 in 5 trans women had to leave college because of mistreatment. So yeah, this was just because I guess our conversation here is going to focus mostly on cis women, but it was just to say that there is a collective effort to be made to include every woman. So that includes trans women as well as non-binary people who are often invisibilized.
100%. Yeah, trans women often don't get excluded from a lot of these analyses because the sample sizes are so small, because as you said, they drop out even before because of bias and harassment and assault. Yep.
Okay, so Katie, when writing about the structural barriers to women in STEM within the profession, you identified 3 main points: the underrepresentation in publishing, less funding for women, and less recognition and visibility. So I would like to first tackle the problem of underrepresentation in publishing, since we have an expert here at our table, Dr. Britta Glennon, who co-authored Women Are Credited Less in Science Than Men. So Britta, there is a well-documented gender gap in the observed scientific outputs. Women both publish and patent less than men. I should maybe show your slides. And from your introductions, I could, because I'm not an expert on the topic, but I could get that the literature seems to say that women are less productive than men because of a number of reasons. For instance, they have greater family responsibilities. They have different positions in the laboratory. Their work is less welcoming. They work in less welcoming environments and so on. But your results actually show that it might not be a problem of productivity, but under evaluation. So if you could maybe explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, I mean, this gap has been well known for some time now. And the starting premise of most papers have been to say that because women produce fewer publications and patents, they must be less productive. And there's a whole host of reasons for why they might be less productive. And a lot of those reasons are absolutely valid, right? So things like, if you are a mother, then you tend to take on more of the burden. And so you are less likely to be producing because you have less time, right? But what we decided to do instead actually was kind of look underneath the hood and say, is there a chance that they're actually equally as productive, but they're basically not getting recognized for their work? And so what we did is we looked at administrative university data where you can actually see who's working on different grants, how many days that they're working on different grants, what their job titles are, all kinds of data like that. And you can basically map a lab to all the publications coming out of the lab. And you can control for things like the different positions that people are in, their particular rank in the lab, right? So their job title, as well as how long they've been there. You can look at things like, what are their sort of collaboration networks, things like that, right? And what we found is that regardless of how you cut the data, when you did this mapping, women were far less likely to be named on patents and on publications at every job title and regardless of field. And so that's what this figure on the bottom left is showing. So in these plots, basically the y-axis is showing the share of actual authorship, and the x-axis is showing the share of potential authorships. Okay, and so if they were equal likelihood of getting named, then everyone would be on that 45-degree line. And instead, what you see is that all of the dots are below that 45-degree line, right? And so what that indicates is that conditioning on the share of women in a particular job title or in a particular field, women are less likely to be named, right? So you can see that that's true for, the one on the left, right, faculty, postdocs, undergrads, research staff. And then on the one on the right, across all kinds of different fields, right? So that spans from, things like biology where there are more women to things like computer science where there are fewer women, right? So it's not just about representation that's driving this, it's really across all fields. Women are less likely to be named. And I don't show this, but we just threw like a battery of robustness checks. We've checked this sort of every kind of way you can imagine. And this is just, we were shocked by how robust this was. And so then what we did was, we kept getting pushback. Like people kept saying, oh, well, you're probably just not accounting for something. You must be wrong here. Like women aren't getting left off. And so what we did is we supplemented this with a survey and with some interviews. And what's important to note is that, so this left corner graph is just sort of top research US universities, right? So you might say that that's a selected sample, okay? The survey was to researchers all around the world at all kinds of different universities. The only constraint that we put on that sample was that you had to have published several times during our time period. Okay, so we're actually even selecting already on people who are even publishing to begin with, right? So we're even missing some people who, maybe never got their name on anything to begin with, okay? And what we found is in the sample, this survey sample, exactly the same result. Women reported being left off of papers more frequently than men. And we asked further, why did they think that was happening? And that's what this graph on the right is. And sorry, it's a little bit hard to read, but what you can see is that the purple line, the purple bars are men and the orange bars are women. And men were actually more likely to say that the reason they'd been left off was because their contribution did not justify authorship. So in other words, they actually hadn't done enough to have earned that. Whereas women were much more likely to say that others underestimated their contributions or discrimination or bias, right? And, there are other things that are factoring in here. So you have personal responsibilities like maternity leave. You have someone leaving the lab. You have non-research responsibilities like service. But actually, these were much smaller than just my work is not getting recognized. We also did some interviews and we also had sort of an open-ended response in the survey. And something that we were really stunned by is, survey responses are usually quite low, but we had huge responses in the open-ended and in the people wanting to be interviewed, right? So this really hit a nerve. There were just so many stories coming in of women who had never told anyone this before because they thought that they were the only one who had experienced this. And there were kind of some themes that came through. So one was, some of the women would say, well, we're not asking enough, right? But of course, there were other stories saying when you did ask, then that can backfire as well. So, it's not really clear what the answer is on that one. There were also a big theme was just power dynamics and personal preferences, right? So I've included one quote here. There's lots more in the paper. In cases where the corresponding author didn't like a lab member, he would not give authorship, right? So there's a lot of this power play going on. There's an issue around lack of clear criteria, right? So every single lab has their own rules about authorship, and that sort of lets in biases. And this is actually something that one of the male respondents said, right? And so this is, something that was broadly recognized that there was this lack of clear criteria. And then finally, we don't actually estimate the long-term impact to researchers in this paper. We're hoping to do that in a follow-on paper, but in the quotes, there were just so many, heartbreaking comments about how it was the lowest point in their career, or how they had ended up in a teaching position because they didn't get credit on X paper, right? Or just the personal pain that they'd gone through. So there were kind of personal and professional long-term consequences. And then just the final thing I want to say before I've now been talking for a while, is that the other thing that really became clear to us in this is that it wasn't just women. And this is a theme that kind of has been already discussed a little bit in this panel. Women are what we were able to measure here. But what was very clear was that it was really anyone who was not in a position of power, right? So any kind of minority, a lot of international students, because of their visa situation, right? They're not in a position of power, and so they were getting exploited as well. And so I think the other thing I want to know is that this is not actually just a women problem. Like, this is much broader.
Yeah, thank you so much for this, Britta. I must say that when I read the paper, I encourage everyone to read it because I was really impressed with the integrative approach of it. Like, it's not that you only analyzed one data set, you actually was much more broad than that. And as you said, it was not only analyzing some data from the patent and publication from a lab, but it was also interviewing people, and I really enjoyed this integrative approach. You mentioned before we went live that you faced barriers. What was that related to these results that you just presented?
Well, I mean, what I meant by that was certainly until we also had the survey and the interview stuff, we just got so much pushback, right? So usually when we would present this paper to other women, they'd say, oh yeah, let me tell you about the time this happened to me, or let me tell you about the time this happened to my friend. Every single woman that we talked to was like, yes, this is something that I've either experienced or someone close to me has experienced. When we presented it to men, for the most part, they were like, that can't be right. And so we really had to, and that's part of why we added the survey and the interview. And I will say, I think we've now convinced most people, although we still get some pushback occasionally, but there was just a lot of pushback, right? That this can't be true, or people saying, oh, well, there's a couple bad apples. And I think our takeaway from this is actually, we're not saying that the PIs of these labs are like deliberately sexist or something like that. I'm sure there are some that are, but what the sort of takeaway that we came away with was that because there's no clear criteria on who gets authorship, it allows implicit bias to enter. And so I think that a lot of people just don't actually see what the women in their labs are doing, right? They're not recognizing it. And it's not anything, mean or sexist or whatever. It's just that they actually have not ever really realized that that's happening. And some of that has to do with, maybe they're buddies with the other guys in the lab. And so they're more aware of what their buddies are doing because they talk to them more regularly, so there's all of these implicit biases happening because we don't have any kind of system in place for this is what qualifies as authorship and this is what doesn't. And so, one of the things that we're really trying to do is even just raise awareness. And sort of the hope is that even the raising awareness will help a bit, because we've had some men, say, oh, okay, I'm going to start paying more attention to this because I didn't even realize that this could be a problem.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
And I'm digressing a little bit, but you saying that there is a lack of rules around authorship, I think it goes way beyond the gender bias.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, academia is, that's my feeling at least, has been built at an international scale without really implementing rules and laws to make it fairer for everybody.
And I should be clear, there were a lot of men who we interviewed and who we heard from in the surveys who were also really upset because they'd been left off of papers or patents, and so this is definitely not a problem that's limited to women. It's just that it seems to be worse for women, but this is a real issue, and just the outpouring of stories and emotions that we got from everyone responding suggests that this is a really big problem. And I think probably all of us have had experiences where, it's just not clear, like, should this person be an author or not? Or you're trying to figure out yourself whether you should be trying to, argue for authorship, or whether you kind of didn't meet that criteria. And no one really knows, because it's different in every field. It's different in every lab. And so it's really a big problem throughout science.
Yeah. I'm sure there are people working on it already, but I feel like that's our generation should really tackle this issue. Let me go back to my notes quickly. So you mentioned the unconscious bias. If I can remind to everyone what this means, it's basically the concept that people act on internalized patterns of which they are unaware and can and often do engage in discriminatory behavior without conscious intent. Do you think that the barriers that women face all stem from unconscious biases?
That's a big question. I mean, certainly quite a lot of them, I think, probably do. I think it's hard to say whether it's all of them, right? But I think it's pretty clear to, not just my paper, but a lot of the other work, certainly what Katie just showed, right? There's absolutely, this is a big piece of the problem. Yeah.
Natasha, can I give an example?
Of course.
From myself? Because
yeah.
I think this is the thing, women think that because they struggle with these issues, they are exempt from putting them on other women or other marginalized groups. And one of my best examples of that, I spend a lot of time thinking and writing about this. This is, in my head, I'm really good at not being unconsciously biased against women. And I was talking about, one time someone was asking me about the department that I was in, not this department, it was when I was in a different job. And I mentioned that, I've been in other departments that had way fewer women than you would expect, but the department I'm in right now is 50-50 in terms of tenure track women. And then I went back about a week later and I actually counted, and women represented 30% of the tenure track women. And I had made that unconsciously because, and this is a statistic, this is a phenomenon that's been shown in lots of papers, that when you're looking at a crowd, as long as there is at least 25% women, people often jump that representation up to equal. And the same thing happens with non-white people. And so in my own head, I had assumed that department had reached gender equality just based on my personal experience. And I was somewhat horrified to realize that I had done exactly the thing, right? And that bias gets into, you're looking at your authorships, you're looking at who you cite, right? Like Britta was talking about who gets credited, but this also goes into citations and thinking about whether you're citing men and women equally, first and last author, et cetera. And so I love to point out to women as well that we are not exempt from this internalized unconscious bias, and that we need to be very, very careful and intentional about how because some of these labs, Britta, I'm sure some of these labs were, or some of these interviewees were in labs with female PIs.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I didn't even mean to imply that this was only a problem in labs with male PIs, because we see it with women PIs too. Yeah.
Although you did, I think, Katie, reported in your paper that the gender of the PI doesn't, that female PI do employ more female researchers?
Female PIs employ more women, but so for example, when that entry to science, one of the first statistics I gave was that if you send out CVs with a male and female's name and you ask PIs whether they would hire them, the woman candidate was offered a $4,000 less in starting salary on average, and the gender of the PI that was offering that salary did not matter. So women were equally as likely to offer a woman less money as men were.
Yeah, that's what I didn't remember about that. I remember that. Yes.
I was wondering, like, regarding this, like, when you have a woman as a PI, is it less likely for a man to be higher as a graduate student, or as a, like, do we have stats about this?
No, men are equally. Women are more likely to hire men. Men are more likely to hire men.
Mm-hmm.
Men and women are more likely to offer the man more money.
So, like, which mean that, so, like, could we say, I mean, like, maybe, like, I'm really going to a straight conclusion here, but could we say that this could be due to the system of research more than anything here, and that, like, there is a kind of something
Possibly,
that pushed to this?
But these were CVs. These were the same CVs sent out with it was just Jane and John. And so in theory, if you're looking at productivity, right, like Britta was talking about, women often look less productive. But in this instance, it was a huge survey. The CV was identical. And so it wasn't about scientific productivity. It was purely, only thing that was different about the CVs was whether they had a stereotypically female name or a stereotypically male name.
That's really interesting. But like, are you planning, for instance, in the future to make a survey in which you would ask? I mean, I guess that it will be super hard because it's something super subjective, but try to understand for what reason they would go more towards.
I didn't write this paper. This paper is from 2012. I think it's Moss. It's a 2012 PNAS paper that was done.
Okay.
I don't know if you share my feeling, but when it comes to gender bias in academia, because it's, well, at least in Western countries, I cannot speak for all the countries in the world, but it looks like it stems from unconscious biases. So it's very difficult for me to know if I was discriminated against because it's very subtle. So is that a feeling that is shared? Deyatima, I know you work both in the UK and India, and now in China as well.
Yes, yes.
How is it for you? How do you relate to that?
So I have a lot of experience to share, actually.
Oh, cool.
So I'm
not sure it's cool, but
no, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's interesting, actually. So I am actually from India, and I did my PhD in India. And I'm very happy that Britta mentioned about this unconscious bias. So mostly where I come from, the society is very male dominated. And it's seeded since childhood that you're a man and that is a woman. And this reflection in academia is just an example of what we are taught, what we have witnessed since years. So I entered as in PhD as in ecology, and my subject was reptiles and amphibians. So that's an extremely male-dominated area. So the first question when I shared what I want to work on was, oh, so do you so you also handle reptiles, snakes, is it? I'm like, if it's necessary, yeah, as a part of the job. So how many venomous snakes have you handled? Because these are all like men. So I remember going to field, which was in Balasore, which is a very remote village. And it took me 3 months to make them understand that, yes, I was there to do a field work on reptiles and amphibians. It was a disbelief, which was very shocking to me because I come from a very liberal family. Liberal family in terms of how families are in India. So I have not really faced all this kind of stuffs in my family or within my peer group, but this was the first time when I faced it. And it took 3 months to make people understand that that is what I'm going to work on. Now, how it affected my work was, so this reptiles and amphibians, one of the easiest method to study them is visual encounter. You go out at the night and you just look for them. I was denied to go out in the night. And so the 2 months of survey took me 3 years to complete. which was I had to build a lot of passive trapping stations. And of course, I didn't have enough fund to import those from the US. So I had to build it myself, which took me 6 months. And this diversity study, just a diversity study, took 3 years to complete. And
That's
continuously,
really a long time.
yes, and so people who have not faced it, it's very difficult for them to understand. If I talk to any researcher who is in reptiles and amphibians and say that, see, this is what I had to do, they are like, but that is not how you sample them. That's an easier way. And there, when you say that, no, I was denied, it doesn't really hold true, because not everyone comes from the same background, not everyone has the same experience. And that is how it affects you, because mentally, physically, financially, I was drained, I was exhausted. And it doesn't end there. So what happened was, since I started this work on reptiles and amphibians, every single time I was challenged that, oh, do you see this person in Facebook handling king cobras? Can you do it? Oh, no, it's not for women, And a very funny incident was this caretaker in the field got a very bad, was very hurt, because he was never interested in reptiles and amphibians, but some girl coming and suddenly working on reptiles was a huge blow in his ego, I guess. And he started handling reptiles and all of it. So at night, there was this snake which just, passed through, under his chair. And there's one snake called a crate, which is a venomous, and a non-venomous snake, which is a wolf, a common wolf snake. So he said, it was dark, and he said, oh, that's a common wolf snake. Just, hold it and throw it out. And I said, no, it is not. The way it moved, it looked like a venomous one. So he said, this is great. So can you just hold it and throw it out? Because you do it. You are a female. You should be doing it. Every time this struggle of belonging and trying to prove is exhausting. And especially when you're doing science, because I wasn't there to prove anyone anything. I was just doing what I'm supposed to do. And so this is in a village where people probably are not that aware of what they're doing. Again, that's a society. But I have faced several issues, even in academia, even in, very well-educated group of people. A simple statement like, oh, that would be very difficult because you're a woman, try to do something which is very simple, is very hurtful, because I did not come to the field thinking that I am a woman and there are certain things which I can do and certain things which I cannot. There's also this difference in payment. Sometimes I have seen my colleague doing more job who's a female than the male, but the salary is much more for the male than the female. And this is not an unconscious, this wasn't an unconscious decision because it was not disclosed to everyone. So this was a very conscious decision that was taken. And yeah, this is how it happened. So I don't really, I don't know, for me, probably one thing that we can do is probably practice equal treatment. This sentence sounds very naive and very shallow, but I think it's the first and the most difficult step to take in life, to unlearn what you have been taught, what you have been witnessing, what you have been doing consciously, unconsciously, and, start afresh. Just treat them as two scientists, and I think it's going to be much, much, much better. About maternity, so in India, there's an age limit to you applying for a PhD or a postdoc fellowship, which is around 35 years. And this familial obligation mostly increases towards the end of your PhD when you're around 30, if everything goes fine, 32, and sometimes even earlier. So having a family, bearing a child, caring for the baby, and then applying for these positions is practically impossible because you do not fall within the criteria of the age limit. And there is no wonder that women do not take a leader position or a good position in academia, and probably just postdoc is the max in most of the cases. And I'm not sure what happens beyond that, but it's very painful. It is.
Well, I'm sorry you had to leave that, Deyatima.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, for me, even then I have been privileged because I had some amazing men in my life who has been supporting me throughout. But I'm sure there are many more enthusiastic women out there who couldn't make it because of all these issues. And somewhere it needs to stop, or maybe we can just take a step to try to realize what we are doing to ourselves and to science, because isn't science supposed to be diverse, creative, and innovative? And we don't even know what we are missing out by, being this sex biased, by not including women equally. Maybe they have got some expertise which the men may not have, or maybe they have, but I don't know what we are missing out actually by doing all of this. And I have also seen my friend working in a lab which is all men lab. They do not want any kind of women and any kind of women related issues in the lab. This is what was told to me. So it was surprising that why all the males are why all your lab mates are males, why don't you have females? Because the supervisor doesn't appreciate female joining the lab. So that also I have seen with my friends. And yeah, I mean, it's this is something which we have I have witnessed quite a lot. And I think in a personal scale for the supervisors, be it a female, be it a male, maybe there should be a 50%, 50-50 position for both the males and both the females, so that at least they get the equal opportunity to come in the lab. But of course, that does not mean that they are treated equally, because again, that's something which is very much in your control. But at least creating equal opportunities could be something which might, improve the situation. And of course, revising the rules, because 35 years of a age limit to a woman, after you expect her to do everything in life plus do science, it's something which is insane and unfair.
Yeah. I think actually the testimony of Tamzin Barber, so this Australian researcher that I'm going to play now because I see that there is only 2 minutes left, really relates to what you just no worries at all. This is a platform for you to be able to speak as well, so this is perfect. But she speaks of related issues. She speaks of, well, motherhood and how it impacted her career, but field work as well, which is a big component in our discipline, animal behavior. So let me try to play it now. Can you hear something? Okay, let me try again. I think it's my headphones. Let me try.
And I'm a psychologist.
It should work now.
Hi, my name is Tamzin Barber, and I'm a psychologist. And I started my academic career in the late 1990s. At this time, there were more opportunities available, and people seemed to help each other out a lot more than they do now, at least in Australia. I study wild dolphin behavior, and this means that field work is necessary to gather data and then also to write it up, get it published, and go to conferences, etc. I feel that my gender made it difficult for me to pursue my academic career once I had a child. No one was telling me to choose between being a mum and my career, but it was a choice that I felt I've had to make, and I continue to make. And the main thing that has made it difficult for me in my career is not really having a child, but lack of funding for my research. So this has meant that I've had to do work in areas that were not related to fund my research myself. And this takes me away from my child even more. To go and do field work is also very difficult, as I mentioned. An example of what it is like for me to be a mum and a researcher is when I spent a full day out on the boat collecting data, and then later that night went home to a sick child who was vomiting all night. And so of course I looked after him, but I had no sleep for 3 days. This really put me off going out to do field work again, as I didn't want to leave him for fear of something like this happening again and me not being there for him. So when I could take him with me, I would, but this is not always possible. And the payoff is limited field work with very little travel to present my research. And as you may be aware, if you're not publishing your work, it impacts your career and it impacts any funding you might be able to get. Outside of the university system, without funding, it's very difficult to pursue my research and make a contribution to science and dolphin conservation. My research has become more of a hobby, as the demands of being a mum take up much of my time, mixed with working unrelated jobs to fund my research. Also, as my parents age, I am now a primary carer for them. COVID-19 has made it much easier in some ways to be a researcher, as a lot of research conferences, etc. are now online, and this makes it possible for me to be involved to a larger degree and be included at some level. To make academia more inclusive, the continuation of online conferences, international support, mentorship, etc. would be so valuable. I think there needs to be more consideration of the impact having a child has on a woman when you're in science. And if you're lucky enough to get a position related to your research or to get funding, then it is much more possible to further your career. Without this, it's a slow, dedicated process to make contributions and be recognised, as well as balancing your family commitments and financial needs, not to mention being exhausted all the time. Don't get me wrong, it's an absolute blessing to have a child, and one that I do not regret having a child at all, but it makes me wonder just how many women have given up trying to contribute to science when family and financial matters make it just too difficult.
Yeah, so that's kind of a heartbreaking testimony here, that it seems like Tamzin was not able to pursue the career that she wanted to because of the barriers she has faced. And I think she gave her testimony to encourage younger female researchers to maybe not give up and battle for it, even though it's difficult for some people more than others. So maybe we could end on a lighter note and look at the possibilities we have to tackle those issues of gender bias in academia. So I'm gonna share your figure. If I can. Oh. Do you want to ask it since you?
So like we have Catherine McCree, so is sending a message. So like she say, I thank you for the opportunity to attend this roundtable. I have a question because it happened to a friend of mine who did an internship and she was not in the author list on the final paper, but she was in the acknowledgement section. So I was wondering if there are data about this case, if women that worked on a project can end up in the acknowledgement and not in the author list.
So we did look a little bit into this, and that's some of what's going on. So you do see, but it's not what we were expecting to see. Is that there would be more women in the acknowledgement section than men, and we don't see that. So this was kind of I think more work needs to be done to really understand if that's part of what's going on. But at least from a preliminary check, it seemed like there were some people who were just being left off entirely, like not even appearing in the acknowledgements. So there's some of both, I think.
Yeah, in your paper, Katie, you also mentioned that women were less funded and less recognized and visible. We talk too much, so we don't have time to tackle everything. But I just wanted to mention this briefly. It's not only the publication, it's not only the productivity, as we saw with Britta, but yeah, if you can just say maybe 2 words about that to sum up.
Yeah, sure. So there are multiple papers out there showing now that women are less likely to be invited speakers in colloquium and seminar series at really prestigious universities. Women are less likely to be invited to speak in male organized symposia. But if the organizing committee is mixed gender or all women, they're proportionally represented on the speaker list. As well as awards, right? So women are less likely to receive prestigious career. Women are more likely to receive early career and student awards proportional to their representation in the field, but they're less likely to receive the prestigious awards. The most egregious case of this, of course, is the Nobel Prize, where women represent an abysmally low number of recipients that aren't the Peace Prize. And so, and all of those, those all become barriers, right? Because when it comes to things like claiming credit, right? Like Britta was talking about in terms of publication, when it comes to claiming credit, one of the ways that you claim credit or one of the ways that you build an international reputation is give talks at places that are prestigious. And if you aren't getting invited, and it's pretty awkward to email the organizers and say, hey, can I give a talk? Right? In theory, you should wait for them to invite you. But as a woman, you are just like less likely to be invited in general. And so that's where, credit in sort of Britta's paper is an excellent example in terms of publications, but that is prevalent throughout the entire system, basically, in every way that credit is given. A paper just came out actually recently showing that labs that have multiple NIH grants are now much more likely to be male dominant. Like most of the labs that have more than one NIH grant now in the United States, something like 70 or 80% of them are run by white men. And that's up from 10 years ago, in part because of the COVID pandemic, actually, as Tamzin was talking.
Okay, so we saw all the challenges that we are facing. Can we talk a little bit about the solutions that we could think about? Katie, I know you already thought about that, but if Deyatima and Britta, you have ideas or you already worked on this topic as well, you are more welcome to share your opinion as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I think should be done is, this is actually the first bullet in this slide about data. So the reason we were even able to actually see that this problem existed is because some universities in the US have joined this data system called IRIS, which is hosted out of University of Michigan, where universities basically agree to share de-identified administrative data so that people can see what's going on within the team, right? And otherwise, we're all kind of forced to draw inferences based on publication data. And the problem with doing that, of course, is that we're missing all of these people, right? That every time you make inference from publication or patent data, there's all these people who you're not capturing. And so the first thing I would say is that, other universities should be joining this system. So, that's, if you have any sway over your university, trying to convince them to join a system like this, would be really helpful for just even trying to dig into where the problem is, and trying to understand, we really just did the first piece, right? So I think like in follow-on work, we're trying to understand like what are the implications of this, what interventions might work or might not work. But in order to figure out what the appropriate policies are, you need to be able to evaluate them. And so for me, you know, the very first step is data. And so that would be sort of my first thing to say. And then I think the second thing is really about, so I think, you know, recognition helps, right? So just, you know, publicizing this kind of information so that there's more awareness. But I think also we have a real problem with how credit is assigned and trying to sort of tackle this problem. You know, some journals have you know, you have to say what everyone did on the project. But, you know, you can imagine that grant agencies might do something like that, right? Where they have to, you know, you don't just say who the PI is, but you actually have to, when you do your reports back to the grant agency, you know, who worked on this grant? How did you determine who gets authorship, right? So I think that there's sort of lots of different levels at which we can get more clarity on sort of how credit is being allocated. So these are just, you know, some preliminary ideas, but I think really we need a lot more data and research on this as well, because I think you need to be able to find out what policies actually work and what don't.
Yeah, Katie, maybe you want to.
It just occurred to me that Britta mentioned that journals are now collecting information about authorship contributions, but as she mentioned, that then misses everyone who's not listed as an author. And maybe the better policy is to ask who worked on this paper or on this, you know, on this project, what did they do? And then decide authorship based on that, right? So that people are not falling off of the list of authors, because that's only collecting, as she said, sort of the people who've made it past the barrier of authorship credit in the first place. I want to walk back this a little bit on the data and on gender representation and minority representation, in the sense that I think we have now collected enough data to demonstrate this is a problem. I don't think we need to prove this anymore. There are new papers coming out every single week documenting these problems. You want to collect data, but you do want to collect data, as Britta said, on your specific institution and to identify where you need to implement policies, right? But we don't need to collect data on whether this is a problem anymore. No. This is we have checked that box. It's time to move on to the next box. But data are really important in terms of identifying, you know, is it in your grad recruitment? Is it in who you retain as a grad, who graduates, right? How long does it take them? All of those kind of things. We had a conversation before this live started about how scientists are just particularly terrible at turning their scientific and analytical lens on themselves. And we need to get over that fear. In part of accepting that this is a problem is accepting that we are going to find these issues in our labs, in our departments, in our universities, et cetera, and saying, okay, I accept that likely I'm contributing a little bit to the structural problem, but I'm committed to changing that. And so identifying, you know, Deyatima's suggestion of like 50-50 representation in labs is a really interesting one. Mostly it's women who apply to my lab. And I think that's true for many, many female PIs, that female students end up in the labs of female PIs because those end up being sort of safer environments in theory. Not always, but in theory. And I think that that's a thing to notice in your department, right? Are all the female grad students ending up in the labs of female PIs? Because that could be a red flag. And so collecting data, identifying where where there are barriers to entry, is asking everyone in your department to talk about authorship credit. What are your authorship policies in the lab? How do they differ by lab, et cetera? I have an authorship policy in my lab. It's written out. It's on my website, students, so it's very clear. And this has been found at field sites, that having codes of conduct drastically reduces the occurrence of sexual harassment and assault at those field sites. And I think that can be true for a lot of these other things. Simply having a code of conduct or a policy on this particular issue means that you're thinking about it. It means that you've at least, now there's a written document that, like, you know, if someone in Britta's data set says, I think I got left off this paper, you have a written document you can go to and say, I'm adding up my contribution to this paper and I can make a convincing argument that I should be added. And so I think it's both, solutions include both collecting data, but also there are some things you can do right now, which is implementing written policies for best practices. We know a lot of what the best practices are. You don't actually need to wait to collect data from your lab about who gets credit. There are some best practices that you can implement right now.
We are over 6 minutes, but there is a really interesting question in the chat. So if we could answer it like very quickly, and then I think it will be a wrap. Valentin Lechefer, who is part of the Animal Behavior Live organizing committee as well, is asking, do the panel members reckon that trying to change the academic system by changing the masculine values it's built upon, productivity, publication metrics, etc., for instance, by changing the criteria for recruiting academic staff would have an instrumental effect on inclusion and diversity?
Yes. I've got it. That's my answer. Yes. That constantly examining what we define as success, how is our lens about what success is gendered? Is it affected by ethnicity or race, etc.? I think those are critical questions that we've only begun to tackle. And I do want to, and this extends not just to how academia works, but how science works, right? How we define concepts in animal behavior are affected by our gendered lens. And I know we don't want to admit that, but it's true. And so, yes, redefining what success means by evaluating success across multiple lenses, both by gender, by race, by country of origin, et cetera, in thinking about what we value would absolutely increase inclusivity in STEM, in an academia.
Okay, I'm gonna conclude here, even though I saw that Britta, maybe you had another opinion, I don't know. But I think we've had the time too much now. But it's great to see that there is plenty to say on the topic, and I think there should be more of this kind of discussion. And yeah, I'm always surprised because I feel like only women attend this type of events, and I feel like it's such a shame. But I can't force everyone to join. Anyway, so wrapping up, I would like to thank you very much for your participation, the three of you, as well as Tamzin, who could not join us live, but she shared a beautiful testimony with us. Tamzin also shared with me her work, so I will try to advertise it maybe on our social media later on. So if you could have a look, that would maybe help her in her journey to try to make her research. For our audience here, don't miss our next seminar next month, which will be about understanding animals, behavior, and welfare entangled. And our next roundtable will be in July, and will be on the role of our personal socioeconomic background and how does it impact our career in academia, where we could potentially discuss the link with the education system of our countries, since it seems to be a key barrier inside the Animal Behavior Live community. Thank you very much again.
As a good note, since you say that usually it's only women who are attending, we have George who say that. Thank you everyone, both speaker and organizers.
That's great to hear.
Thank you for inviting us, Natasha. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for putting this together.
It was an honor, really.